I never imagined I'd be questioning my partner's loyalty. We'd been together for years, and our relationship had always felt solid, built on trust and understanding. But then, slowly, small things started changing. At first, they were easy to overlook, tiny moments that made me pause but didn't seem like a big deal on their own. Like how he started coming home late, claiming he was working extra hours or handling new projects. I wanted to be supportive, so I'd shrug it off, reminding myself that he was working hard for us, for our future. But then, more things started to pile up. He'd always been one to share the details of his day with me, even the boring parts like what he ate for lunch or the minor annoyances at work. Suddenly, those details vanished. Whenever I asked about his day, he'd respond vaguely, sometimes even seeming irritated that I asked at all. It was as if I was invading his privacy, which was strange because we'd never been that way with each other before. And then there was the phone. That was probably the biggest change, and if I'm honest, the thing that first made me really suspicious. He used to be pretty casual with his phone, often leaving it lying around the house. But out of nowhere, he started being overly protective of it. He'd take it with him everywhere, even into the bathroom, which wasn't something he'd done before. And whenever he'd place it on the table, it was always face down. It was such a small thing, but I couldn't help but notice. It felt like he was hiding something, and that thought started eating away at me. I tried to push these doubts aside, telling myself that I was overthinking, but deep down I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Every time he'd say he was working late or had some last-minute plan with friends, a part of me couldn't believe him. I'd find myself watching his every move, analyzing his expressions, his tone, everything, hoping to find some reassurance that I was just being paranoid. But all I found were more questions. This growing suspicion felt like a weight on my chest, making it hard to focus on anything else. I started to feel trapped, like I was the one hiding something, carrying this secret doubt about someone I thought I knew so well. It's a strange feeling, to go from trusting someone completely to suddenly questioning everything. I wasn't sure what to do or where to go from here, but I knew one thing for certain: I couldn't keep ignoring this feeling forever. As the days passed, I found myself spiraling deeper into suspicion. My mind kept playing tricks on me, filling in blanks with worst-case scenarios. Every time he'd leave for work or step out to take a call, my heart would race, wondering if this time I'd catch him in a lie. It felt ridiculous, like I was becoming someone I didn't recognize, someone obsessed with tracking every move of the person they loved, but I couldn't seem to help myself. I began sneaking glances at his phone whenever I had the chance, which wasn't often since he'd started keeping it close to him at all times. When I did manage to grab a peek, I'd scroll through his recent messages or emails, but there was nothing out of the ordinary, no suspicious texts, no incriminating emails. It was almost like he'd anticipated my suspicions and was actively hiding things from me. That only made me more certain that something was going on. I wanted to believe it was all in my head, but the pit in my stomach wouldn't go away. Then, one night, I noticed he had a second email account open on his laptop. It was only for a second, but I caught a glimpse before he quickly minimized the window. My heart pounded as I casually asked if he had a new email address. He looked at me with a strange expression, hesitated, and then shrugged it off, saying it was just for work. I knew I should let it go, but the moment stuck with me. It felt like another piece of a puzzle I didn't even know I was trying to solve. The more I tried to find proof on my own, the more careful he seemed to get, like he was one step ahead. He'd make sure to take every call out of earshot, and on the rare occasions I asked to borrow his phone, he'd hover nearby, watching me like a hawk. These behaviors were so unlike him, yet he acted like they were completely normal. It left me questioning everything, and worse, questioning myself. Was I imagining things? Was I becoming paranoid? The constant second-guessing was exhausting. Eventually, I began noticing patterns, or maybe I just convinced myself I did. He'd always come home later on certain nights, and every time he'd say he was stuck at work or had a meeting. Part of me wanted to believe him, but the other part of me felt like I was being strung along, left in the dark while he hid something huge. I felt helpless, torn between wanting to confront him and knowing that without solid proof, he'd just deny it, turning the blame back on me. The more I tried to ignore it, the more desperate I felt to uncover the truth, no matter what it took. After weeks of sleepless nights and a constant sense of dread hanging over me, I knew I couldn't keep going like this. The stress of second-guessing every little thing, of trying to piece together clues with nothing solid, was starting to consume me. I'd never imagined I'd get to this point, but I was out of options. I needed answers, so I decided to do something I'd once thought I'd never do. I hired a private investigator. The decision wasn't easy. In fact, I wrestled with it for days, feeling a strange mix of shame and fear. The thought of calling a stranger to dig into my partner's life felt invasive, almost wrong, like I was betraying him by even considering it. But then I'd remind myself that he was the one who had driven me to this point. If he wasn't hiding something, then what did I have to lose? I needed to know the truth, even if it meant taking a step that felt so drastic. When I finally made the call, my nerves were a wreck. I half expected the person on the other end to sound skeptical, maybe even dismissive, but the investigator was calm and professional, which helped me feel a little less ridiculous. I could tell he'd handled cases like mine before, and he was understanding, explaining the process clearly and reassuring me that everything would be handled discreetly. That promise of discretion gave me a weird sense of relief and dread at the same time. I didn't want my partner to know what I was doing, but the possibility of finding something real, something undeniable, was terrifying. The investigator asked me a few questions to get started, details about my partner's schedule, the times he was usually working late, and any patterns I'd noticed in his behavior. I gave him everything I could think of, feeling a strange mix of guilt and relief as I recounted all the little signs I'd noticed, the things that had been keeping me up at night. He didn't judge, didn't question me, he simply took notes and assured me he'd start as soon as possible. I hung up feeling exposed, like I'd crossed a line I could never uncross, but I also felt a small sense of power returning, like I was finally taking control of my own life instead of waiting around, hoping for honesty that would never come. Now there was no turning back. I'd handed the responsibility of finding the truth over to someone else, and in a way, that was freeing. All I had to do now was wait and hope that whatever he found would finally give me the answers I'd been searching for. A few days later, I got the call I'd been dreading. The investigator had findings, and he wanted to share them with me in person. My heart sank. I'd spent those days trying to prepare myself, going over every possible outcome, telling myself that maybe it was all a misunderstanding or that maybe he'd find nothing at all. But the investigator's tone on the phone told me everything I needed to know. There was no escaping it now. I braced myself for the truth, whatever that might be. When we met, the investigator wasted no time. He handed me a small file, and my hands trembled as I opened it. Inside were photos, clear and undeniable. My partner, the person I'd spent years trusting, was with another woman. They weren't just meeting up for a casual coffee or dinner, they were acting intimate, close, like a couple. They'd been meeting at different places around town, but what struck me the hardest were the images of them together at a hotel. That image alone felt like a knife to my heart. I could feel my chest tighten as I looked through the evidence, each picture another blow to the life I thought we'd built together. I wanted to turn away, to pretend I hadn't seen it. But the images burned into my mind, each one more devastating than the last. This wasn't just a one-time mistake or a fleeting lapse in judgment. It was clear from these pictures that he'd been leading a double life. He looked happy, relaxed, like he wasn't carrying the weight of any lies at all. The man I saw in those photos was a stranger, someone who had no problem betraying me while living out another version of his life with someone else. The investigator went on to explain some of the details he'd uncovered. My partner had been seeing this woman regularly, slipping away under the pretense of work or late nights at the office. He had been so careful, orchestrating every move to keep it hidden from me. I listened, numb, as the investigator filled in the blanks, confirming my worst fears and answering questions I hadn't even dared to ask myself. I had been right to trust my gut, but that realization didn't feel like a victory, it felt like a loss, as though everything I believed in was crumbling around me. As I sat there, the reality of it all started to sink in. The truth wasn't some distant, abstract thing anymore, it was right in front of me, undeniable and brutally clear. I had proof, but it came at a price. My heart was shattered, and with it, any hope I'd had that we could work things out, that I'd been wrong all along. The betrayal was real, and it cut deeper than I ever thought possible. In that moment, I felt a mix of heartbreak, anger, and utter disbelief. This was the truth I had fought to uncover, and now that I had it, I didn't know if I'd ever feel whole again. After leaving the investigator's office, I felt numb, as if I were moving through a fog. My mind kept replaying the images and the facts he'd shared, each detail like a weight pressing on my chest. I had asked for the truth, but now that I had it, I felt lost. I went home and sat alone, the silence around me thick with hurt and betrayal. Every corner of our home, every framed picture and shared memory, seemed tainted, like they'd been stripped of meaning. I didn't know how to move forward, but I knew I couldn't stay in this limbo forever. The next day, I prepared to confront him. Part of me wanted to throw the evidence in his face, to let him see the damage he'd caused. Another part of me dreaded seeing him, fearing that he'd deny it or turn it around on me. But this time, I had proof, and I was done with the lies. I couldn't live with someone who could look me in the eye while living a double life. I needed him to see that I knew, that I wasn't the fool he'd thought I was. When he came home that evening, he seemed completely unaware of the storm waiting for him. I watched him, feeling a mix of anger and sorrow as he went through his routine, completely oblivious to the fact that everything had changed. Finally, I told him we needed to talk. He looked surprised but agreed, sitting across from me with that calm, collected look he'd always worn. For a moment, I almost couldn't go through with it. But then I remembered the photos, the lies, the months of agony he'd put me through, and I found the strength to lay it all out. I showed him the evidence, watched his face as he processed that he'd been caught. At first, he looked stunned, then angry, as if he couldn't believe I'd gone to such lengths to find the truth. He tried to defend himself, making excuses, but the lies fell flat. I realized in that moment that he wasn't sorry for betraying me, he was only sorry he'd been found out. His words felt hollow, insincere, like he was just going through the motions to save face. I felt a deep sadness then, knowing that the person I'd loved had never really existed. Walking away was painful, more painful than I'd ever imagined. I wasn't just leaving behind a relationship, I was leaving behind years of memories, hopes, and dreams we'd shared. But I knew staying would mean betraying myself, allowing someone who didn't value honesty to remain in my life. I deserved better, and I had to believe there was more waiting for me beyond this heartbreak. In the days that followed, I started the slow, painful process of healing. It wasn't easy. Some days the loneliness felt unbearable, and the weight of betrayal was suffocating. But other days I felt a new strength, a reminder that I was capable of moving on. The truth had shattered me, but it had also freed me from a relationship built on lies. I'd lost something I once cherished, but I'd gained something more valuable, my self-respect, and the chance to build a life with someone who deserved my trust.